Hello, everyone. This is Aran. I am an educator of philosophy based in Austin. I am interested in German philosophy of the 19th and 20th century. And today we're going to talk about Hegel Contra Sociology, a book written by Gillian Rose. Hello, Trent.
Hi, listeners. My name is Chen. I'm a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China. I'm interested in cross-cultural comparison and the history of religions. Good to be here with you, Aran.
Good to have you. So let's start with a biographical sketch of who Gillian Rose is. Gillian Rose was born on 20th September of 1947 to a non-practicing Jewish family in London. She was a British philosopher and writer that held the chair of social and political thought at the University of Warwick. Her work revolves around the criticism of neo-Kantianism, postmodernism, and political theology. Her final publication, The Love's Work, is a memoir that details her philosophical and non-philosophical past and her long battle with ovarian cancer that finally took her life at the young age of 48. Today and in the next couple of episodes, we will focus on Hegel Contra Sociology, Rose's bold, albeit rather cryptic, defense of Hegel's speculative philosophy against and as a remedy to the Kantian and neo-Kantian thinking in sociology. In these discussions, our focus will be mostly on Rose's approach to Hegel. So we do not really want to be dragged into all sorts of detailed scholarly debates on interpretation of Hegel, but we're mostly focused on how Rose frames Hegel's story and how she thinks this is all going to be related to humanities and social sciences in general. The way that Rose herself thinks about her project or expresses it at the beginning of the book is making way for a non-foundationalist account of society. Although she doesn't mention the concept of society, but I think at the core of it, it is about the concept of society. And with this non-foundationalist and Hegelian approach, she wants to overcome the dichotomy of nihilism and rationalism that she thinks permeates the Kantian and post-Kantian thinking and philosophy and humanities. This intellectual disease of collapsing onto one or the other side of this equation. And Rose thinks that Hegel's approach might give us a clue of how to get out of this dichotomy. So Trent, could you tell us a little bit more how this dichotomy of nihilism and rationalism could present itself in the bigger debate over enlightenment and counter-enlightenment that has been the theme of our discussion so far?
Absolutely, Aran, with delight. For those of you who have been following our podcast a little bit earlier, you will know that we talked about S.I. Berlin's book, The Three Critiques of Enlightenment. And there, our number one takeaway, so to speak, is the key debate between the pro-Enlightenment thinkers and the counter-Enlightenment thinkers is the problem between the universal and particular or individual. The pro-Enlightenment camp tends to collapse the individuals into the universal by abstracting particularities out of a common pattern or universal nature or something. For instance, reason is what defines human beings, such a thing. And this, in a Rose language, translates it into rationalism, which ignores all the empirical expression dimension of the human communication and thinking. But the counter-Enlightenment thinkers that examined it in, as I Berlin's book, namely Vico, Hamann, and Herder, emphasized the incommensurability or the untranslatability across cultures. They tended to prioritize cultural identities as ways of self-expression which is indispensable for human beings, over some universal cross-cultural patterns. But the problem of counter-enlightenment critique, as we analyzed it in the 3 podcasts, is it won't just stop there, because any means of constructing identities, collective identities such as cultural, regional identities, must use abstracting, namely universals as well. So if you just apply this deconstructing or fragmenting approach, emphasizing the gap across different cultures, the answer is not you get the cultural relativism, but the answer is you get epistemological nihilism. You cannot really know any culture, not just another culture, but even your own culture, because you cannot really understand another person or even another thought outside you or outside this moment. So I think the perennial conundrum lying at the heart of a counter-enlightenment and enlightenment debate is very well captured in Gillian Rose interpretation of, or in my understanding, it's like a situation of the Hegelian enterprise in philosophy. So I think this book is of great value for not just philosophers or philosophy educators, but also for any person who's interested in cultural interpretation or like history or basically self-understanding in general. So yes, so there's much bigger and long-going tradition behind this enterprise, I would say.
Yes, that's a fascinating way to make this connection. And although Rose herself is rather cryptic in this book overall in many different ways, I think what she has in mind is also something beyond, like, Hegel's scholarship, right? She is interested in, because she's interested in how the problem of rationalism and nihilism, enlightenment and counter-enlightenment, represents itself in other areas. Her project is by nature, I wouldn't say interdisciplinary, but not limited to scholarly works within the boundaries of philosophy. Definitely the goal is something that goes higher than that. The way that the book is structured is rather strange, but there is a rhythm in how the book follows. Rose does not provide like a first-hand argument against Kant and argument for Hegel. The way that the book is structured is that the book starts with sociology and ends with sociology. And in the middle, Rose goes through all sorts of texts by young Hegel, mature Hegel, the books that are more known and major in Hegel's scholarship, and lesser known works. And in all of those, Rose finds the treatment that Hegel, or the criticism or the opening that Hegel finds against this Kantian problem. And the book begins with showing us what this problem is in the sociological context, and it ends by reminding us of what that problem was. And in the face of all of these developments in the book, how there might be a way out of this problem. So the nemesis, the idea that Rose is continuously going back as something of a problem, could be summarized as the neo-Kantianism of modern sociology. What is this neo-Kantianism? First off, the neo-Kantianism is allegedly a critic of Kant. All the neo-Kantian thinkers, which I include philosophers and sociologists, want to rise against Kant, want to somehow challenge parts of Kantian structure, respond to him. But Rose's main idea is that this neo-Kantianism, when at its depth, at its core, is still loyal to the most basic methodological commitments that Kantian system affords. Basically, neo-Kantianism does not evade the problems of the Kantian system. It restructures it, it reproduces it, but it doesn't get away from the main issues. And we're going to talk about these issues shortly. But there is another theme that I found very interesting in Rose's viewpoint here, and that was the mentioning of the Marxist sociology and Marx himself, because that has been the fate of Hegelianism. We are trying to escape that legacy in the past few decades, but what happened to Hegel was Marx took over. The Hegelian influence survived in Marx, and Rose, I believe, does not see that as something positive, because the sociology and thinking that is influenced by the Marxist approach to Hegel has a structural problem. The structural problem is that what these thinkers that take Hegel seriously, it seems, do is that they just go ahead and borrow some concepts from Hegel, like objective spirit, but smuggle that concept into a Kantian structure, right?
Right.
Or they want to say that, okay, forget about all this stuff about the absolute or Hegel's, quote unquote, idealistic approach. Let's forget about that. Let's extract something from Hegel and just go ahead and apply it to somewhere else, right? This could be a concept like objective spirit that Rose thinks people like Habermas, for instance, do that. Like just they borrow concepts from Hegel, but they don't borrow the spirit of Hegelian system. They don't really appreciate that part. Or it's about method, right? Like Hegel thinks about dialectics in terms of like concepts and ideas. Marxists would say that, okay, this is just, an idealistic nonsense, but the method is good. Let's take the method and apply it to historical development, apply it to the matter. And this is another problem. This is another way that the problem with the Kantian structure of modern sociology, the way that it reemerges. So either it is neo-Kantianism in terms of a response to Kant himself that maintains its connection with Kant, or it is a more radical, seemingly a radical departure from Kant and coming to Hegel's camp, but that entrance to Hegel's territory is a very limited, because the spirit of Hegel's approach is lost. Only some scattered, isolated concepts or method has been borrowed and applied to something new.
Right. I very much like this summary of the new Kantian critiques of Kant and how that presented itself as a critique of a model, but in fact perpetuates the discourse constructing mechanism or structure of that thinking, that Kantian thinking. And I think a good way to re-articulate what you just said about the Marxist interpretation of Hegel is perhaps the bifurcated reception history of Hegel. Those new Kantian interpreters of Hegel's idea, which tries to revolutionize the way we related to Enlightenment, Counter-Enlightenment debate, somehow uses the Kantian method. We're going to talk about that in next slide, to turn Hegel's unified and inseparable enterprise, which has both content and or concept and method, into either the very neat and its skeleton, the method, and apply for different things, or turn his thinking into raw material to be processed by the Kantian framework. So I think that's the main limited and the Kantian spirit that Rose is trying to address and remind the readers of.
Yes, and the way that this is done in the text is that, especially in the beginning of the book, Rose shows us in different ways how this Kantian root stays in place despite all of these changes, all of these figures, all the figures that Rose talks about at the beginning of the book, and Marx included, which she talks about him at the end as well. Durkheim, Weber, Marx, Gadamer, all of these people are critical of Kant. But Rose continuously tells us that they're not critical at the core. They're not criticizing the very basis of how things are done. And the way that this is presented, there are different ways to phrase this, but I think they all converge into one or two main points. What happens in the Kantian system, I think they're approaching this from the problem of method, which we're going to talk about more, is going to be interesting. So Kant's transcendental method, what is it trying to do? Kant's transcendental method is trying to look for the conditions of possibility of a given concept. And that's how Kant tries to overcome, in his own way, the dichotomy of rationalism and empiricism, right? So when you look at something like the Critique of Pure Reason, the structure is a repetition of a one structural approach. He goes on and say that, okay, if you're an empiricist, what do you believe in, or what do you posit as something real? You posit experience as something real, right? Now, let's ask this question: how is experience possible? Then what Kant does is to say that, okay, to answer the question, how is experience possible, for instance, one must accept that personal identity exists, right? Or something like the unity of agency meaningfully exists. What does that do? That will reply to someone like Hume, that wants to be an empiricist, wants to talk about experience, but doesn't want to talk about personal identity. Okay, so now Kant says that, okay, if you want to talk about experience, I have shown you that you need to talk about personal identity. You cannot have one without the other. Same with the rationalist trend, right? Descartes, do you want to keep the self? Let me show you why the self is inconceivable without the conception of time, and how time is inconceivable without the conception of an existing material world, right? Without the other than the self, right? So if you want to keep the self, you need to keep the world. And in this way, and this is not the end of this story, but this might summarize the core of it, what Kant repeatedly does is to start from a given concept, given position, and show what it takes to hold that position, what it holds to think of that concept as something real. And he goes around and does that with different concepts. That's what he does. And that's a big step in overcoming the dichotomy of rationalism and empiricism in the way that it is presented in Hume and Descartes, for instance.
Right.
But the problem with this approach that we are going to see is the emergence of some dichotomic thinking, some fixation on concepts, some understanding of concepts as having some fixed relations to one another, and then trying to bridge them, presupposing a distinction and try to bridge things, and not being able to expand the criticism to the basic assumptions of the system, right? And this will show itself in presupposing conceptual dichotomies, like concept or intuition, for instance, in Kant, that is not derived, that is not open to criticism. It cannot be criticized in a way, or freedom and necessity. These are like conceptual dichotomies that the system begins with. And it's not that we need to not start from presuppositions. That's not the problem. The problem is that there is no way to readjust these relations within the Kantian system. So we have fixed concepts with fixed relations. Now we want to see how they are connected, how one is the conditional possibility of the other. And because we have started with some abstraction and distinction, there is always this problem of the gap. How is it that the realm of morality, for instance, for Kant, is absolutely distinct from the realm of instincts and impulses?
Right.
But we have both. Like how these two should go together. And that's where something like faith comes in. That okay, we need to like have some postulates and posits that tell us that okay, they will converge, right? We can never know. Reason can never find the origin or the convergence, but we need to establish some sort of a hope, some idea of how these things are going to come together. And that is where not reason, but faith comes in. That of course is not to say that Kant's system is just, like pushing everything to faith. Of course, there is room for reason, but it seems like at a very basic point, because the beginning has been this very rigid distinctions, and the system itself cannot repair itself and rethink that relationship, all it can do is to attempt to bridge these distinctions. Then if they are originally distinct, morality and instincts, freedom and necessity, concepts and intuitions, the bridging becomes something forced, or something that we need to just, assume, or some other approach. And all of these points show themselves in the sociological thinking, post-Kantian sociological thinking. So Trent, do you want to talk about that part?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it will be, I'll try to summarize what you just said to make sure that we are on the same page and the listeners that are still with us, because within 5 minutes they give a rundown of 300 years of history of philosophy, which is hard for non-specialists to follow. What I hear, a very intriguing point you point out, I think Rosa points this out, is Immanuel Kant seems to apply his method of criticism or critical thinking into his positive construction, because he's reacting, as you said, very well established to two strings of thinking, empiricism and rationalism. Both are started with an unquestioned given. And he criticized that by saying, well, you have to ask yourself what conditions must have been present for such postulated concept to be possible, but he does not really question the consequence of such postulating. That is, he criticized the content of the fixed categories, but he did not see problem of that very act of postulating. By postulating a category, say self, whatever, or reason, say, better follow your example, you automatically buffer that category from other categories that used in your reasoning. And this proves to be really, how to put it, convenient for constructing dialogues or debates. And we can see that very clearly in sociology. The three key so-called founders of modern sociology: Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. I'll focus on Weber and Durkheim because that these are the two cases that are given by Rose in this chapter. That Durkheim starts with precisely that Kantian approach by taking something as a fixed entity, and you cannot really use its internal material to improve the category. And that category for Durkheim is a society. And Sociology 101, Emile Durkheim provides the concept of social facts. That's the things that are external to individuals, but structures individual behaviors, like language. Like you are born into certain social facts, and your presence or absence there does not or could like have some influence on the manifestation or interaction of that social factor, but this does not challenge the very nature of social factor as being external to individuals. But Max Weber would take a completely different given concept. For him, was the value rationale, multiple, but the one focused on here is perhaps value or culture, my language. So individuals are somehow embodiment of certain non-material, like a symbolic system that are rationalized and inform their motivation or to do something. And that thing is not, how to say, you cannot use individual behavior as like empirical evidence to challenge the very proposition of certain values. You can say, oh, a certain Christian or certain Southern Baptist does not do what a typical Southern Baptist does, but it doesn't mean the very concept that there is a Southern Baptist culture out there is invalid. No matter how many observations you make, you relativize, you change the description of such a category, but the very category itself is not challenged. It's still like contrastable or comparable with other so-called cultures. It's precisely the Herder problem of where does this cultural identity come from, and how are we intuitively recognizing certain things as cultural identity, certain things are not. And same thing applies to Durkheim, that by positing like social facts of society as the given fact that we consider human beings are social animals, therefore whatever they do would have social implications. It's just in some cases they're visible, there's some cases they're harder to like fathom, but it doesn't mean they are not social. But like the boundary of a society, how many people constitute a society, those questions are really are kind of impossible to address within the same system. So contemporary sociology is really interesting because it has multiple paradigms. Some people follow Durkheim, some people follow Weber, and the whole so-called discipline could progress because they borrow, say, Weberian examples, shed light on what a society really is, what holds people together to form a society, basically using Weber's cases to substantiate Durkheim's proposition, because you cannot do that internally, vice versa. So Weber does not talk about a society as a category, but his ideas on like charismatic leadership or what kind of a way to construct authority really provides influential and insightful for our understanding of the coercive nature of a society. And Durkheim's so-called moral community definition of a religion or society does not question what is a society, but it sheds a lot of light, provides vocabulary for anthropologists to describe cultures. So just as you say, like only by fixing one given concept, you can start to describe other things, like what Kant did to like Descartes and Hume, by questioning what kind of conditions must be necessary for something to be possible. We're able to bridge such different things, but those things in such bridging become assumed as fundamentally buffered or separated. So you introduce a dichotomy, then you provide a solution to solve the dichotomy, and never justifying why such categories are autonomous and are self-sufficient at first place. It's just not, this whole way of thinking does not lead to that kind of question. I think that's why Rose is very much offended or depressed by the very fact that new Kantian framework is the dominant way to construct paradigms in humanities and social sciences. So that's why attention here, in my eyes, she doesn't really talk about that in her book, but I think it is still like it timed, it aged very well. That's why in our contemporary Anglophone higher education, interdisciplinary is so emphasized, and interdisciplinary somehow presumes the autonomy of each discipline. So by borrowing, I don't know, like Weberian sociology, you can inform cultural anthropology and vice versa, but that only perpetuates the givenness and the takenness of the existing disciplines. What if the disciplinary boundaries are wrong at the first place? You would never come to that positive or concrete contribution to proposing really radically new categories. You are just saying, well, we should consider history when talking about the cultural identity, or we should consider like a power relationship when we're talking about a religious devotion. So as mutual borrowing, therefore mutual constituting, existing and received unquestioned assumptions. Yes.
That's a beautiful comparison with the idea of interdisciplinary and the concept of discipline itself, because I think you are absolutely right in finding that connection there. The aim or the energy behind interdisciplinary studies seems to be something valid and powerful in terms of, in analyzing a phenomenon. We need to bring these different disciplines together and look at it and use the resources that are from all of these disciplines to look at the same subject matter. But in that process, what is never challenged is the notion of disciplines themselves, the differentiation between the disciplines. And I think, like, I really like the way that you use the word buffer, because this is going to be very important when we get to the next point about the question of method and how Hegel deals with this problem. I think the problem, because we can think about this problem in two different ways. It doesn't matter if it's Kant or the new Kantian sociology. The problem seems to be that differentiations are posited and they're not derived. We're not shown the part that shows us why these differentiations are valid is missing. Why they are fixed in their places in this way, that part seems to be missing. Now we can have all sorts of sophisticated analysis of the relationship between these things, right? Just like, the neo-Kantian criticism of Durkheim, according to Rose, for instance, follows the same, it again thinks about, like, for instance, let's go back to the concept of experience, right? How is experience possible? Now, maybe Durkheim adds something about sociality in that regard, like there needs to be that element. What others do, according to Rose, is that they keep finding more sophisticated conditions of the possibility of experience, history, embodiment, like all of those stuff start to be part of this scenario. But that fixed relationship of the condition and the condition doesn't change. And I think there are two very different ways to have problem with this. And that is going to have two very different paths. One is having a problem with positing arbitrary in the first place. So this would be, I would call it a Cartesian problem, right? What is Descartes' problem? Descartes wants to start from a very solid foundation that is devoid of any presuppositions.
Right.
That's what he wants to do, right? He wants to say that, so Descartes actually very clearly understands this problem, that look, it seems like that we just start
Right.
without really having a foundation that we can build things upon. Like, we cannot make sure if the concept of, say, society has any meaning unless the concept of society itself is structured upon a concept that we are certain of its meaning and validity, right? So we got to start from the ground up, and we got to start pure and immediate, so that we can build this very, like, sophisticated but justified conceptual regime, right?
Right.
That's one way to go. The other way to go is to say that you can never start from a pure and immediate position, but you can have a rhythm of dealing with concepts that those presuppositions at their core could change. In other words, a system in which there is no conceptual buffer, everything is subject to reconsideration perpetually. There is this capacity of the system to just go back to itself and look again and look again and look again. In that sense, we are not talking about a foundationalist approach, but a non-foundationalist approach. A system that is not Cartesian, is not denying the necessity of starting from oppositions or starting from a conceptual map, but it is about how that map could be changed at its core so that the fixed concepts are not fixed anymore. Right. How could we do philosophy or do sociology? You're going to start with, like, the concept of society. But if you manage to build a system in which that very beginning of your system that was, built upon the concept of society itself could be changed and reconsidered, then the conceptual buffer has gone without starting from a presuppositionless position, which is a very Cartesian instinct. So with this, I think we can look at the problems that Rose thinks Hegel has with Kant and, the rest of the neo-Kantian sociological tradition, and we can have a glimpse of what Hegel's solution to these problems could be. Now, the problems that Rose talk about throughout the book, as I mentioned before, they are not neat and tidy and structured in a very direct way. So what we are trying to do here is to reconstruct Rose's approach and see what are the core issues. And needless to say, we need to disregard or we are not going to include all sorts of other discussions that exist in this book, like, for instance, on art, that is not, it exists in this criticism or this account that Rose brings out, but it's not part of these main problems. The main problems that Rose thinks Hegel finds in the Kantian enterprise is the problem of method and the problem of dichotomic thinking. And these two problems are very much intertwined. Right. And it's not like that these are two completely different problems. So what we can do now is to have an overview of, like, what these problems are about. And in this episode, we will talk about the first problem, the problem of method, and how Hegel offers a solution to the problem of method. What would it be a solution to the problem of method? And in the next episode, we're going to talk about dichotomy thinking in more details. So the problem of method is something that, according to Rose, and I find this very interesting. This is the part that I haven't seen elsewhere. It seems to me somehow original in Rose's viewpoint. There's a ton of material and like Hegel's criticism of Kant and Hegel's criticism of Kant's methodology, right?
Right.
But what Rose mentions is that the problem is not just about Kant's method, it's about methodology first strategy in general, starting with a method in the usual sense. And that's a very bold claim.
Right.
Because it raises the question of, okay, then what is Hegel doing? If Hegel is not just abandoning Kant's method, but reconstructing the meaning of method as such, then what does that even mean?
Right.
What does it mean to have a philosophical enterprise without having a method? What does that even imply? And we're going to talk about that. So, Trent, before I go to the overview of the second problem, do you have anything to add to the first problem, a general problem? We're going to talk about it in details, of course, but anything in general?
Yes. While you were talking about the three critiques of Durkheim, some weird thought came to my mind out of nowhere. That it sounded very much like a subtraction theory. That, for instance, we go back to like 5 minutes ago, we're talking about like a Durkheim's concept of society, and later on, Benjamin, whoever come in and say, well, you must introduce new controlling factors to better really understand what society means. I think that's precisely the not just Kant's method, but the Kantian method that is criticized in Hegel's Enterprise, as is summarized by Rose, is the moment when you are criticizing a category by introducing new categories, you are fixing the method and justifying such fixation with your proposition of a theory. This is what I observe in, say, humanities or empirical division of the humanities that tend to do is you must have a theory first, which radically limits the experience or data you're interpreting, and within it, you'll find your specific method to describe the raw material. So what has been the first cut, 99% of stuff you are not seeing are justified not by the data themselves, but rather by some theory that derives usually from a critique of existing theory. So people are like smart enough not to postulating on justified assumptions anymore, so they tend to derive such unquestioned assumptions from either the discipline itself or from the theorists that they are criticizing. But the very core of the very foundation is still that unsanctioned, unjustified category or theory, and with that, you start to like limit and zoom in and find stuff find like cultural experience, whatever, and you're interpreting those experiences only with a filtered a colored lens. You are not seeing raw material as they are at the first place before going into an examination. You already know what you want to see before seeing anything. So I think that's the problem of most empirical studies in humanities and the social sciences. At least that's the impression I get from reading Rose's book, and my personal experience very much conformed to her frustration. And I get really excited when she says that Hegel's philosophical enterprise somehow contains such a preemptive critique of the way humanities and social sciences are been done in our time. So I then really look forward to a radical concept method being proposed. Of course, this method is not detailed and substantiated in Rose's book, but I think she absolutely convinces me that Hegel's concept method is very different from the type of method I just talked about. It's not like there is a theory that first limits the inquirer's understanding of, say, culture or society. Then you use a fixed method to substantiate that theory. I think this one, the very nature of fixation that it is baked into a Kantian enterprise in terms of method or theory is fundamentally rejected by Hegel. So that's my reaction.
Yeah.
Do you want to take that over? How perhaps Hegel's concept of dialectics or his critique of dichotomic thinking envisions a completely different nature. It's not a definition or anything. It's a nature of method. How method, something really abstract, really to a certain extent universalizable, could be informative and illuminating when we are approaching the particular or individual. I think it's quite different from the absolute dichotomy envisioned between like a concept or method and say evidence or experience in the Kantian framework.
So now I'm hearing two things, and I think these 2 points that you mentioned, they're gonna be very informative on how we should approach Hegel's dialectics. One is that not only particular concepts in this neo-Kantian / empirical studies are fixed. It's not just that the concept of society is fixed and then we are just, basing everything on that as like an unanalyzable concept. But the method itself is fixed. So there is not just particular concepts within the system, but the method of how things should be done is fixed. That's the one thing. And the second thing is that the data in, let's put this in the context of what you said about theory and data. The data is incapable of radically changing the theory, right? The theory is just, okay, we are not looking at the data so that we could change the theory. The theory is fixed. Now, within that, we could have like all sorts of data, and they could change some predictions. They could change, the data could inform one another, but they don't have a very basic relationship with the theory. It's not that we go and look at the data, and the data suddenly just makes the whole theory collapse, right? Although I think there is an interesting parallel that we don't need to go through that way. But as you were saying this, I was remembering the structure of scientific revolutions, Kuhn's book, in terms of how this process happens when the empirical data is like accumulation of discrepancies and problems and practical issues and all of that. Then the paradigm starts to shift. But that itself, that kind of a structure might have something similar to what Hegel has in mind, but as it pertains to a very basic concepts. I think that's going to be Hegel. It's not going to be an empirical data in that sense. And in the second, we might be able to see why that's the case. So the second problem that we are not going to talk about it in this episode, but it is very much related to all of this stuff that we have talked about, is just the presupposition of dichotomic relations between concepts that happens in the Kantian and neo-Kantian systems. And the resolution to this is going to be something very problematic for Rose and Hegel. That either it's something like faith or some one-sided relativization of one concept to the other.
Right.
And like you need to subsume nature under freedom somehow, some sort of a dominance. Morality and ethical relations. Morality must subsume the existing customs under itself. And that's how they, quote unquote, get united. The unification is done through devouring of the other within itself. It doesn't have a dynamic relationship. The dynamic relationship dies. One becomes dominant and the other becomes submissive. But as we're going to talk about this further in the next episode, I don't want to add much more, but I think you have something of a parallel here that you want to talk about. Let's talk about that.
I see. I want to start not with the cross-cultural comparison, but rather a new thought that came to my mind, that you mentioned Kantian approach to overcome separation is through subsumption. That by develop that a little bit, I forgot the way you articulate that question. I think the subsumption is the positive way to do a content project, and the subtraction is the negative way to do content critique, and they feed each other in the sense that, for instance, if we have a society and we subtract certain parts of it out, say history, art, whatever, we frame it as a new content critique of a content project. Say, there come you're right because you ignored gender. There come you're right. You're wrong because you ignored, say, like historical contingency. And the response to that is really the subsumption. Say, okay, yeah. Now we have a autonomous realm of a history and the non-historical part of society. Why don't we just bridge them by subsuming, say, either history into society or vice versa? So the fundamental nature is that separation, and this kind of separation is very much also criticized in both Buddhist thinking and Taoist thinking. And then for instance, in the so-called Axial Age period, in 4th, 5th century BCE India, you had the precursor would later on become the so-called dualist thinking among Brahmanic tradition. Basically postulated the world is very much interconnected, and fundamentally individual self or soul, Atman, is not different from the cosmos or Brahman, and a person's ultimate liberation depends on that person's realization of the identification of self and the cosmos. And Buddhism, especially later on Mahayana Buddhism, came up with a criticism, hey, but you are essentializing without justifying what is a self and what is a cosmos. If you really go down into whatever sensory experience that informed your presumption there is a self or soul, or there is a world out there, you will go to the conclusion that there's no such permanent and an unchanging constituent at the first place. So the answer must be there's no self and there's no cosmos, and the mutually constituting. But the Buddhist, especially Mahayana Buddhist idea, basically stopped there. They later on developed different theories to try to say, so how are we making sense of our life? Are there, say, moral precepts that we should abide by, even though there's no self-identity nor world identity? I think Hegel, I'm not sure he's informed by that, but he's critique of Kant to a large extent parallels to the early Buddhist criticism of so-called dualist Brahmanic thinking. And the other parallel I see is in still the same period, but in China, the Taoist thinking, which the first line of Tao Te Ching, the famous classic ascribed to Lao Tzu, semi-historical figure, the opening line is the way that it can be talked about is not the constant way, which is a direct criticism of the dominant hierarchy apologist, either in the so-called legalist tradition or in the so-called Confucian tradition, that we can observe certain, or at least assert a certain stable differentiations that among social members, and the state or our culture is the way to socialize the different members so that we're attuned to such differences. And those are the different, because it's such a pattern, such a differentiating pattern is derived from the heavenly way, the constant way. But the Taoists that would come up with the criticism and say, hey, let's take it as you mentioned, let's take it as you suggest, that there is a heavenly way out there, but it must not be the way you are constructing in ordinary human language, because all the things such a way, concrete way described to pertains to are changing and developing, and the king's way needs a commoner's way to be of any meaning. So they are not self-sufficient, they are not autonomous. If there were such a everlasting constant way, then that way must be contrary to what you are proposing. It's not subject to any fixation. It's not talked about in the ordinary way of speaking. So therefore, I think that second order criticism of accepted the problem of accepting unjustified categories or assumptions were very much present in many other cultures, not just the European intellectual tradition. But I think the core are very much the same. Of course, Hegel did things very different from those thinkers, because he is really trying to provide a alternative that is comprehensible within logic, not dismissing the human capability of comprehending such precariousness of human categories like language. Unlike both Buddhists and Taoists, they were kind of really suspicious whether linguistic capacity for human beings are able to elevate ourselves to that realm of understanding. So they are to a large extent using mystic experience or meditative experience to supplement what they cannot demonstrate positively. So that's why I think Hegel probably has more interesting or more constructive things to say for people like us who are seeing the problem in, say, new Kantian projects than the other two.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think as we proceed and see Hegel's alternative, not just through Rose, but through other resources as well, this comparison might get more concrete in saying like how and why Hegel thinks that this solution is articulable, like, and it is comprehensible, and it's not about the limitation of language, it's not about something of the limitation of intellect or concepts, it's about our misunderstanding of what concepts are and what abstractions are and what language is. And I think as we proceed, we might have a better view of this divergence despite the original interest in resolving this tension of why Hegel thinks what he thinks, or is he going to succeed in the face of a criticism that is coming from, for instance, Taoist tradition? Is he going to survive that criticism? So with that, let's move to the problem of method more in a more focused way,
right?
Because the problem of dichotomy thinking is going to come back, and we're going to talk about it. The problem of method, as we talked about, it's not just about Kantian method. It's about a very specific understanding of what method is about what you call the buffering, right?
Okay.
In the case of Kant specifically, for instance, the Critique of Pure Reason, what is Kant's project? Kant's project is a critique of pure reason. What is the limitation of reason? What reason can do, and what reason cannot do. What is the difference between understanding and reason, and how is reason connected to sensations and intuitions? Like what is this structure, right? The ending of the critique of pure reason is the establishment of the limits of reason. That theoretical reason, for instance, is incapable of finding any solution to the problem of freedom and causality. In a theoretical sense, we cannot resolve or establish whether freedom exists or doesn't exist. As soon as we prove one side, that freedom doesn't exist, we need to accept that freedom exists. And as soon as we say that freedom exists, we have to accept that freedom doesn't exist. So the reason cannot give answers to those types of questions. Is everything infinitely divisible or not, for instance, right? Questions of that are beyond the limits of reason. So the idea is that critique of pure reason finds the limits of reason, criticizes reason, and finds where it goes wrong, where it overreaches, and tries to solve problems it cannot possibly solve, right? That's what critique of pure reason is doing. Now, the problem that Rose identifies, and this problem is not something that is only coming from Rose. This is something that is rather well established in understanding Hegel's relationship with Kant, is that what is other than reason is doing the examination, right? If the critique of pure reason is about examining reason and finding its limitations, what is doing this examination? And that creates some contradiction in the project itself, because what is required is a distinction between the inquiring reason and the inquired reason. The reason that is doing this critical enterprise and the reason that is being criticized. And as it seems, Kant wants to buffer the former, the inquiring reason, as saying that, okay, like that reason, the reason that is doing this inquiry, that's fixed. The reason that I'm criticizing is it is done through that reasoning, but forget about that. What is this process of inquiring itself? That is fixed. Now let's talk about the problems within reason in this specific with this specific territory, right? What Hegel is saying to this situation is that examination of reason or cognition before or prior to exercising it is impossible. What Kant wants to examine must be used for the examination, and that creates a very strange and interesting structure. What is supposed to do the examination is the same as what is being examined, and Hegel thinks that Kant does not appreciate this very strange and interesting structure. He wants to think of the examining reason as something that is buffered from the examination itself, as it is clear in the quote from Hegel. He says that we ought, says Kant, to become acquainted with the instrument before we undertake the work for which it is to be employed. For if the instrument is be insufficient, all our trouble will be spent in vain. But the examination of knowledge can only be carried out by an act of knowledge. Right. To examine this so-called instrument is the same thing as to know it. But to seek to know before we know is as absurd as the wise resolutions of Scholasticus, not to venture into the water until he had learned to swim. Right. So it's this is an arbitrary distinction. Examination of instrument, right? And that is also in the introduction to phenomenology, Hegel talks about this. That, okay, like being worried about whether we have the right instruments. Right. Well, to know whether you have the right instruments, you need to use instruments. That's the problem. If you want to know whether reason is valid, you need to start with reason being valid in some way to ever being able to examine. What granted Kant that reason could examine itself in this way? What is the critical examination of that? If he wants to do the critical examination, where is the critical examination of what is examining the instrument? What is that? Where is that part? Which is all to say that this is the return to this whole idea of checking the validity before actually participating in the process of reasoning. And this is only possible if a buffer has been introduced to the system. That, okay, we're going to examine the instrument. What is going to examine the instrument itself doesn't need examination.
Right.
Yes, let's examine the instrument. And okay, now we found that this instrument is right for these purposes and not for the other purposes. So what Hegel is saying to Kant is not that we shouldn't criticize reason. What Hegel is saying to Kant is that you are not criticizing reason at all, because you are not. A very important part of this whole process is to be critical about that reasoning itself, which takes us back to the main theme of this whole conversation that we've had so far, that when you fix the apparatus, the examining apparatus, the method, the beginning, this something that is buffered, that is not just one concept or the other, but it's just this machinery,
right?
Then all you need to do is to just apply it. But someone could show up and say to Kant that, look, you are presupposing all of these stuff about what this examining, what this inquiring reason is. And if I start from somewhere else of what this examining reason is, then the examination itself will take a completely different shape. Right? The fact that the critique of pure reason has its structure is dependent on what Kant's understanding of this examining reason is, right? And again, we have that dichotomy that, okay, so does that mean that we need to find some sort of a pure immediate path, like a beginning that does not have this kind of a, presupposition, right? Which I think is either take us to the path of Descartes, the foundationalist, immediate certain fact kind of an approach, or some sort of a strong skepticism that you can never start from there. So knowledge is impossible, right? Something along those lines. Or they could take the other path that I think is the Hegelian path, that it is not a problem that the examining reason, our conception of the examining reason itself is flawed, if we let the system to be able to reconstruct that conception itself. If we can have this relationship that the examining reason itself is examined, then we have made some sort of a progress. So we don't need to start from pure immediate facts. We need to get rid of the buffer. We need to apply the criticism to the examination itself, to how we're examining as well.
Yes.
So that's what I got for this. Do you have something to add to this, Trent?
No, I don't think so. Well, one thing, just connecting what you said with your mention of Thomas Kuhn, I think Kant did not consider sufficiently the impact of an observer would have on the whole experiment, and that perhaps could be tied back with the intuitive separation between so-called human sciences and the natural sciences that in, say, our earlier Hegel Contra Enlightenment debate, that we cannot treat that we cannot treat human knowledge, human science, this approach human knowledge in the same way we approach natural knowledge, because we are very much both at the same time the subject and object of this whole knowing enterprise or project. And I think Kant somehow has certain unjustified either hope or faith in standing above that the phenomenal world in which it lives in. And it will be very interesting to see where that conviction came from, perhaps from, I don't know, Stoicism, Christianity of his time, that kind of, you can be in the world but not of it, that kind of thing. But I think it is just my cultural historian's inclination, but it's not central to this Hegel alternative to the Kantian enterprise. I think you summarized it quite well.
Yes, I want to just mention something very briefly before we go to the next slide, just a reference, because it's very interesting that you mentioned this parallel, because a lot of Hegel scholars like Terry Pinckard think that Stoicism, Christianity, and Kant, and Hegel's criticism of all of these enterprises, is just the same problem. It's the same problem at different levels. You see, like their structure is the same. One to transcend and still be immanent, right? One, like self-transcendence, unjustified self-transcendence, and the denial of the other. Like the relationship is always this, like a godlike, observant that is just detached, but also part of. Yeah, it's detached from the process and it's also part of it somehow. It is able to connect, but is not part of it. The examining reason could definitely examine all sorts of things in the world, but it's somehow immune to something, immune to that work. It could stand above it, as you said. So I find that parallel very much accurate in terms of like how Hegel also sees the relationship. Now, the last thing that we need to talk about here is, okay, what is Hegel's solution or alternative? Like what happens? And we have, like, I think, built the necessary resources to have a sketch, a solid sketch, let's call it, of what we should expect from Hegel's understanding of method or his dialectics in response to all of these scenarios. And Rose mentions points here and there. It's not like that, there is one chapter on Hegel's method. So we have just extracted these points from different parts of the book. But the first point that is important, and this is something that Rose reminds us over and over again, is that the task of, this is the first code, the task is not to change the method, because the method, as Rose understands it, imposes schema on its object by making the assumptions that it is external to its object and not defining it. This idea of self-exclusion and transcending the object of study. And the same point is mentioned by Rose about phenomenology. Why there can't be some, introduction to phenomenology in a very, you cannot state the final answer or, the result at the beginning, because that would be just, that is not coming out of the process itself. That is already presupposing something. It's not really showing the derivation is not there. So what Rose points out is that the method is something that only comes at the end of the inquiry, right? Understanding of what the question is not what the method is. The question is what the method was. You see, that's a very different approach to method. It's not that we start with that, okay, let's find the right method. Let's learn to swim first and then see what is a good way to learn to swim and then just swim. No, you just jump and you just do different things. And at the end, you can say that, okay, this was what was going on. This was the right quote unquote method of doing this. So in this sense, what Hegel is looking for is something very much experiential, but experiential, not externally experiential in the empiricist way, but conceptually experiential, right? And that's what I like. Rose connects three different German concepts together, and I think that's very, very helpful. And it is, to me, very astonishing that these terms in German have this kind of a connotation that is very like connected. So Hegelian dialectics, we have the immediate experience, das Bekannte, that okay, that's the beginning, is a partial experience which has to be re-experienced or known again, anerkannt, in order to be fully known, erkannt. Das Bekannte, anerkannt und erkannt. So what does that mean? In the sense of like the Hegelian structure, this means that we definitely start from somewhere, and that somewhere is definitely something in a way arbitrary, in a way, like in a sense that we could have, like Hegel's phenomenology, for instance, I think it could have started in many different places. Hegel has a reason why he starts from where he starts, but it could have started with elsewhere. The point is, this process is important. The process is that, let's say, we start from a way of understanding and juxtaposing the self and the cosmos, the self and the world, right? And we start there, and then what we do is to see that, okay, if I think of the relationship between the self and the world as like the self is absolutely passive and is immediately perceiving the world as it is, right? This is just one way to understand this relationship. I am in the world and everything is just immediately perceived and received and processed. What does this position really imply? And what happens in Hegel is that he shows us that if you accept this position, you're not accepting this position. There is some sort of an internal conflict in this position. Your understanding of the relationship was partial. This needs to be looked at again, experienced again, that, oh, okay, it cannot be what I thought. Okay, so now I think of it in this new way, and you continue doing this. So I will mention a couple of points about and a couple of concerns about this point, about this relationship. And then it's yours to tell me what you think about this. Okay. So Hegelian dialectics, whatever Hegelian dialectics is, it cannot be a method per se. It cannot be a method in the way the transcendental method is, right? So because of all the stuff that we talked about, if the method is fixed, the examination is not complete, right? And if the examination is not complete, the concepts are not justified properly. Right. They're just presupposed. Okay. Now, what does it mean to say that Hegelian dialectics is not a method per se? My original thought about while reading Hegel was that the Hegelian dialectics is about this process that I just described.
Right.
That you start with a position, you internally look at that position and look if that position makes sense on its own terms. Meaning that your observation should be the opposite of question begging, right? It shouldn't be that, whatever, like empiricism is wrong because rationalism is right. It cannot be something like that. It cannot be just like assertion of the opposite as the argument against the position. So it must come from something inside. So if it's coming from something inside, what is convincing? We should ask in what way the position holder could be convinced that their position doesn't make sense. Right. The only way that I can think of that they could be convinced is that they find that their position does not make sense based on the resources they have. Right? There is some internal incoherence that, for instance, if they want to hold that position, they must hold something opposite to their position. Right.
Logic.
There are a couple of problems with this understanding, and Rose does not talk about this directly. We have talked about this before, and some of this stuff could change here. One is, in a way, this looks like a transcendental argument to me in some of its aspects. That's something that I think Charles Taylor once called negative transcendental arguments, right? In the sense that you want to say, so let's go back to what Kant was doing. Kant was saying that, okay, Hume, you want to say that experience exists, right? Let me show you what is the necessary condition for experience. What is that process? That process says that experience is only possible if you accept something that you didn't want to accept at the beginning, right? That the self must exist, let's say, right? For the simplicity, right? Now here, the way that I'm describing Hegelian dialectics is not absolutely like that. It's more like the negative sense that you thought this is the case, but to accept that this is the case, you need to accept something that destroys the original position. So it's not like that it is affirming the original position.
Right.
And that might be the difference, right? And now as I'm describing this, I'm seeing some of the differences here. The difference would be that in the transcendental argument, experience is fixed, the condition is discovered, and the concept of experience doesn't change. In the Hegelian dialectics, with the understanding of the necessary condition for holding this position, the original position is destroyed and changed. You see what I'm saying? The fixed conception changes. The fixed conception in the Hegelian dialectics is not fixed, and it becomes moving. Right. So I think although there is this kind of a similarity between this immanent criticism and showing this kind of a relationship that if you want to hold this, you have to hold this other thing, right? If we abstract from Hegelian dialectics as every single episode and transcendental methods, I think they are very similar when it comes to this structure. If you want to hold this, you need to hold this other thing, right? But for Kant, that relation does not affect the original concept, let's say experience. It just shows that you have to hold this other thing too. In Hegel, once you understand the quote unquote condition for holding the original position changes. The original position doesn't make sense. You need to change that original position. So there is a moving element in that regard. One more thing that I add, and then you tell me what you think about this. Right. Is that okay? One position shows up, internal inconsistency in the way that I described, it collapses, a modification comes in, and the same thing happens again. Now, isn't this a prior application of method in the same way that we have, why isn't this a method? Isn't this a method of go and find the internal inconsistencies and just move on? Isn't that something that, could be criticized? Couldn't Hegel be criticized that he's also using a method?
Yes.
It is strange, but I think the way that we have talked about this makes something very different here, right? What is this difference? That's about this whole idea of Aufhebung, like how this resolution comes to place at every stage. Like there is a contradiction between consciousness's definition of itself and its real existence, right? What it thinks it is not, it turns out not to be true, right? It turns out to have some sort of a fundamental internal consistency, and that leads to the next modification.
Right.
The way this modification works cannot be predetermined. In that sense, each Aufhebung, each resolution may be a completely different story than the other, right? There is no pattern of how a position fails on its own terms, right? So in that sense, it's not like that one go find this flaw in all of these systems. What constitutes a flaw itself changes based on where we are. What constitutes a flaw when we're thinking about what I was describing in terms of the relation between the self and the world, in terms of this passive reception of immediate facts, is going to be fundamentally different from the way that when we get to the chapter of spirit in the phenomenology, for instance, and he talks about French Revolution and the relationship between that quote-unquote self and the world.
Right.
These do not have the same type of flaws, and they do not have the same type of resolutions. And what would be the resolution along the way is not going to be the same. Nevertheless, I think there is still a problem here, that if we were talking about abandonment of method and really thinking of the end, the method comes at the end, I don't know what to make of this whole idea of the Kant about this experience of internal inconsistency and modifying the position based on the failure of a position. What is this if this is not a method? So that's my, I can see a lot of things are starting to move. A lot of the fixed parts in the Kantian and New Kantian thinking, I see them moving without a doubt.
Right.
In Hegel. But I'm not sure if that part is moving. Like if someone shows up and tells Hegel that, look, this is also something that you are kind of like presupposing, what would be Hegel's reaction to that? He would say that, oh, sure, I'm presupposing, but that understanding of what it means to move based on internal inconsistencies is itself changing. So that is not fixed. Is that going to be his response? Or he's going to say that I'm not even presupposing that. This is just happening. This is not something that is presupposed. That itself is something that you just see at the end of the inquiry. So that's what I got. What do you think?
Yes. Quick response. I have no answer to the question you posed, and I very much agree that, at least based on Rose's very short summary, these questions are not explicitly addressed. That she lives, that her readers in darkness, that their own struggle. But I do think, based on the way Rose presents Hegel's whole enterprise, the method must not be prescriptive, like the Kantian method. It does not limit the resource, the horizon. It doesn't put a limit to the horizon for you to draw things that contradict your original point. What I think it is missing in our current understanding of this, what there seems certain implicit identity holding mechanism in the whole Hegelian capital M method, that the thing, the immediate experience, the Bekannte, and the Anerkannt and the Erkannt, the fully known and the re-experience, something connected them that is embedded in itself. And we do not really know why and how one experience can remain still the same experience after such dialectic elevation or Aufheben. Why from A1 to A2 to A3, if we call the 3 stages of an experience, are still descriptive of the same A, instead of transforming into B, C, D, F, because we can, there's no fixed category, like in the content sense. There's no fixed method in the content sense. So what really kind of identifies the 3, if we don't want to use the word fix, the 3 as a one thing, what constitutes this identity? I don't know. I'm just like imagining at this point Hegel's concept of the absolute, perhaps it is the way, perhaps retrospectively justifying or telling the experiencer that why such different elements, different episode stages of experience, or its distortion are guaranteed to be the same because their relation to the absolute, I don't know. But I think he must have a very different, much more subtle way to justify his identification, not in the Kantian method of fixation. Second point is on your reflection on Hegelian method. I think it cannot be the Kantian method, because the dialectics was already a method in, say, pre-Reformation scholastic philosophy that famous the case is sic et non, and in pedagogy for people to better understand, say, what the scripture, the Bible is really saying. The master would propose a different seemingly contradictory passages from different parts of the Bible and ask the students, okay, if you maintain the scripture that is always correct and is coherent, here's a contradiction. But the difference between Hegel and that scholastic dialectics is, first, the medieval ones, they still maintain there's the scripture and non-scripture distinction, and there's higher realm of knowledge, and that is so still buffered, separated from the ordinary whatever sensory experience or other stuff. But that thing is not, that limit is not imposed in Hegel, as far as I'm aware of. And so method is more like a adjustment. You are free to look at it wherever, to find whatever tool or whatever to criticize and to reflect upon the original proposition. The received so-called scripture or other ordinary knowledge distinctions must not be maintained. I think that's precisely how Hegel differs from, say, the Kantian thinkers that he's criticizing, because they were not willing to give up the absolute boundary between the relevant knowledge and irrelevant knowledge. But I think for Hegel, such a boundary isn't there at any moment of this so-called method. So the method must change. The resources you draw on, their domain, their realm could evolve based on the specific speculative experience, the proposition you are examining at a specific stage. But we haven't read Hegel directly, so I'm just imagining at the moment. But I think presents
there is.
It's very
go ahead.
No, I'm done.
Okay, so yes, I think there are a couple of points there. I will address them briefly, and then we could wrap up this this episode. Yes, in terms of what makes this part of like one experience and then the next experience, and like what is this? Yeah, I have a feeling in general from what I have read from Hegel and my exposure to him is that he thinks that like arrival at the concept of the absolute, for instance, could be done in many different ways,
I see.
right? In terms of like how you delineate the boundaries, for instance. It is not about that part. I think could have, as I said, I think Hegel would agree that you could have started from somewhere completely different, the whole phenomenology, and that's not the point. The point is that, like, think about it this way: that he has examined whatever these viewpoints, maybe just haphazardly and chaotically, and then he has reorganized this so that there is some sort of a development, or like almost like a Bildungsroman of just something like, there is a developmental pattern to it. I don't think that is essential to the final point, in the sense that it is essential that Hegel thinks he has organized it in a developmental structure. So if you start with French Revolution, right, then there are all sorts of other viewpoints that you have not even, considered, and that's going to be a problem. So he thinks this structure makes sense because it considers all of these positions that are needed to take us to the standpoint of absolute. And I agree with you that, like, Hegelian dialectics it's this openness of the dialectics that is not, which is going back to the whole point of the buffer. Hegel does not have buffer, or at least he recognizes that he shouldn't use the buffer. That's what he does. That it's not like that, there's everything, like, they're going to examine, but the scripture is just correct, right? It's not like that there is some sort of something is excluded from this process. Everything is involved. Just like you will see that Pyrrhonian skepticism shows up in the phenomenology, which is a very radical criticism of the idea of criterion in general. So even like radical positions like Pyrrhonian skepticism have their place in this phenomenological experience. One last thing, though, is that I'm not sure about, are we presupposing some very basic laws of logic in understanding like this quote unquote failure of position on its own terms? Like, what is determining a failure of a position? And how did we arrive at that conception? That is not very clear to me. One way to look at it is to say that, okay, you need to take that from the position itself too. But in a way that seems rather question-begging to me. Think about the position that says that I am the passive receiver of immediate facts from the world, right? And that's the relationship between me and the world. I'm absorbing the world as it is.
Right.
And, whatever. Just, everything else is just nonsense. This immediacy is what matters. Immediacy and certainty. Now, okay, let's say we want to see if this position, quote unquote, makes sense. And let's say that makes sense means that there is no internal inconsistency in holding this position, right? But in spotting what this internal inconsistency might be, I don't know, I can think of many ways to think about internal inconsistencies.
Right.
The stuff that don't make sense to me, right? Like, what constitutes this internal consistency, inconsistency? Is it like someone could say, just for the sake of argument, that inconsistency must come from a feeling, right? Like, I just feel this is inconsistent, right? And if I feel it is inconsistent, it is inconsistent. That's one way to look at inconsistency, right? Another way to look at it is to just articulate it and see if it contradicts itself. And these are not the same ways of understanding inconsistency. So where does our conception of inconsistency come from? Is it something that we carry from the beginning? And I can understand that the concept of inconsistency could be developed. I have no problem with that. But I cannot fully understand why any concept of inconsistency is privileged over the other.
I see.
Based on what? Like, if someone says that, okay, the inconsistent, I'm like, I am the French Revolution, right? I am that perspective. I think of the inconsistency in my position as, something practical. If things go to crap, then that means my position was inconsistent, right? I'm very like empiricist in thinking of the inconsistency of my position. Well, that's one way to think about inconsistency. The other way is that, okay, no. If my position is not articulable based on the basic laws of logic, that is what it means to be inconsistent. So I don't understand this point about inconsistency. I understand the development of the concept of inconsistency. I don't know what motivates Hegel to say that, okay, this is what constitutes inconsistency.
I see.
So that's something that Rose is not going to give an answer to us. But I think it's something that when we start talking about in more details in later episodes on Hegel's logic and how he thinks of this process, those points may become more clear. So if you have something to add it, and then we end this episode.
It's just like comment or reaction to what you just said. I think that's brilliant. I think the question is, the general question we should bear in mind in reading Hegel's own writings is, how does he deal with universals? Like, is there certain universal human rationality or reason to a certain extent maintained or accepted, which serves as, I don't know, maybe a external like a criteria that in pushing forward each stage of inconsistency, observing and moving forward? If that's the case, how is his use of the universals different from like Kant's use of universals? I think there must be certain places in which universals play a really instrumental role in Hegel's system. I just want to see how he makes it clear and transparent, and how that connects with the lack of a predetermined assumption of any universality or, say, methods, concrete in the Kantian sense of methods in his enterprise. So those are open-ended questions we should bear in mind when we're moving forward this project. But I think your observation absolutely to the point. It's not addressed in any way in Rose's book, at least. So, but it's central to Hegel's claim of a real alternative to Kant's project.
Yes, and I think if like there is going to be a problem for Hegel if there is some external presupposition about what making sense means. If what he is trying to establish is what makes sense, if that, again, it might be the case, and this is the part that, like, I'm not saying that Hegel cannot start with a conception of what inconsistency is. Like, I'm not providing a Cartesian criticism of Hegel that he starts from having a presupposition. I'm just not understanding like how that conception itself even starts to get challenged. I understand how the position will be challenged based on the conception of inconsistency, but I don't see the development of the concept of inconsistency in the work. And this is a question that we should bear in mind for later discussions. So let's end this episode. We'll be back on continuing Rose on dichotomy thinking in Kantian philosophy and neo-Kantian sociology, and how Hegel would respond to the approach. See you guys soon.
Yes, thanks for listening. See you next time.